Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I wanted to explain a little bit about yesterday. I made a video wishing everybody a happy 4th of July, and I realized that some people might be offended because, some people just don't acknowledge the 4th of July for reasons that I stated in my other Juneteenth video. And also, others might have been offended because I appeared without a shirt on. However, I did give an explanation for the appearance without a shirt, and as far as the historicity and the validity of 4th of July, you can look back at some of my other videos earlier on my channel when I explained that virtually every holiday is controversial for one reason or another, that someone might not want to celebrate it because of religious beliefs, um, beliefs in its invalid invalidation as far as historicity is concerned, or just ambivalence. But the reason why I wished it and I made the video was because some people on my channel do celebrate it and they do acknowledge it, and for them it is Independence Day. I realize for individuals of color such as myself, it is not, because of reasons that I'm going to explain in this video. But for other individuals, such as many of my Caucasian followers, it is their holiday and it is their Independence Day from the British Crown. Now, whether or not all of America should be celebrating it, that is debatable. But I acknowledge the rights and the humanity of all of my followers, and I wish everyone a happy holiday on every holiday, whether or not they celebrate it, whether or not they choose to acknowledge it. That is up to them. Some people just view it as a day to explode fireworks, and that is fine as well. But like I would say on Thanksgiving, like I say on Halloween, like I say on Christopher Columbus Day, like I say on Christmas, even, because of course some people on Christmas even will say, well, Jesus really wasn't born on December 25th according to the Bible, so I don't celebrate that. Individuals who are Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't celebrate any holidays. So I might have some people on my page that are Jehovah's Witnesses and they don't acknowledge any holidays regardless of historicity or importance to them as individuals at all. So, in order to not offend, every holiday I just wish anybody who's celebrating it a happy holiday, whether I celebrate it myself or not. That's just how I roll. As far as the shirt situation, I explained it. It was very hot, according to me. Now, some people said that it was not that hot. Again, whether or not heat is an issue is again subjective. Some people might feel it's 80 degrees is hot. Others from other places or other body temperatures might feel that it's not, that 80 is not hot at all, that they've experienced temperatures that are up to 150, 200, whatever. Everything is subjective. But what is not subjective is the history of 4th of July and why some choose to celebrate it and others do not. Much like Columbus Day, for some it represents a day of adulation, while others it represents a day of oppression. As many know, On July 4th, 1776, people of color were not included in the plan for independence of the United States. It was specifically only for white Americans. This, I thought, was commonly understood by most Americans, even those that want to celebrate it. We all know that slavery in this nation didn't end until 1865. So in 1776, when the Declaration was signed and what the holiday celebrates, people of color were not included. Another group that was not included besides African Americans was Native and Indigenous individuals, commonly known in common parlance as Indians. Of course, many people refrain from using this politically incorrect language of Indians. And not only is it politically incorrect, it is historically inaccurate because the so called Indians don't come from the nation of India. They, in fact, come from, what is today considered Siberia. And 10,000 years ago, they crossed over on a land bridge into North and South America, where they populated both continents and were completely genetically isolated from Europeans and other old world groups until 1492. Again, I thought this was commonly understood by most Americans because we grew up in this with the same curriculum that we learned. Of course, there's a different spin on it because the people teaching it are mostly mostly white Americans, so they celebrate these heroes and these holidays that people of color don't celebrate and don't look at in a positive light because of atrocities like slavery, colonization, the Trail of Tears, the decimation of indigenous people in regions such as the Caribbean, etc. Someone asked me to explain how did we get from Christopher Columbus to the Revolutionary War. Well, here's my best explanation of it. Prior to 1492, like I said, Europe and America were completely isolated from each other. Most Europeans and other old worlders, such as the Asians, were afraid to cross the Atlantic Ocean because they perceived the Atlantic Ocean to be inhabited by monsters, a whole bunch of myths developed around the Atlantic Ocean. So, and some people even believed the world to be flat rather than oval shaped as it actually is. So, no one actually crossed the Atlantic Ocean until 1492, and Columbus made contact with the indigenous people. Now, then, rather than treat the indigenous people with respect and dignity, he and the Spanish crown at the time, which was looking to expand its political influence after um, 500 years of warfare with the Muslims, they had reconquered the Iberian Peninsula from the last of the Muslim empires in Granada, the southern part of Spain, and they were looking to expand their political influence. So rather than um, respect the indigenous people and learn to live alongside them and to trade with them. He instead conquered them and subdued them and subject them to slavery. But because of the genetic isolation and because of diseases that Europeans brought along with them, many indigenous people perished at the hands of these European conquerors known as conquistadores in Spanish or conquistadors in English, and or conquerors, and they were replaced by slaves from West Africa. Um, After that, Spain got immensely rich from conquering. They expanded their reach from conquering the Caribbean to conquering Central and South America, which included the Aztec and Incan empires, Incas in South America, and Aztecs and Mayans in Central America. Other Europeans became jealous and envious of the Spanish, and in addition to being in religious competition with the Spanish, um, wanted a piece of the American pie. So in 1607, Queen Elizabeth I launched her first expedition to the Americas, in which the first British colonies or English colonies at that time, there was no Britain, was founded in what we know today as Jamestown, Virginia. There was an initial other colony in Roanoke that was founded, but the settlers in Roanoke perished because of disease and whatever. So Jamestown is considered 1607. The founding of Jamestown is considered the first permanent British settlement in North America. And just like um, with the Spanish, rather than respect the rights of indigenous people and the the dignity of indigenous people, they subject the indigenous people to conquest and enslavement. And just like in the Caribbean, many indigenous people died off because of disease and because of war and because of enslavement. And again, just like in the Caribbean, they imported slaves from West Africa. After this, the British continued to expand their reach into other places: South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, eventually taking over parts of the Dutch, the Dutch New World, which included New York. And we had 13 colonies, and we had 13 colonies after that. And then the 13 colonies, the colonists in the 13 colonies, the white colonists wanted to expand to the northwestern territories in places like Ohio and stuff. And the British government, later then it was called the British after the Act of Unions of 1607, 1707. England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland became one country united under one crown, the British. They wanted to expand, but the British had a treaty with various Indian tribes, and this did not sit well with white settlers. So um, that was one reason they decided to declare their independence. Another reason was that Britain had engaged in battles for North America with their longtime rival, European rival, France. And and this resulted in the French and Indian War. And once the British won the French and Indian War and acquired the territories now known as Canada, uh, Britain was forcing the colonists to pay off these war debts and were imposing heavy taxes on them. Now, a lot of the colonists disagree with the taxes, and they disagree with a lot of oppressive acts like the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and all these other acts. So they decided to declare their independence. And they did so on July 4th, 1776. A war ensued, and then in 1782, they won the war, and we became the United States of America. And that is basically the basic gist of how we got to from Columbus to the 4th of July. Then after that, as we all know, the United States, the newly minted government of America, developed and continued to oppress and conquer indigenous tribes from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. They acquired later land from Mexico in the Mexican-American War of 1848, and later they expanded their reach to Caribbean nations such as Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Southeast Asian nations such as the Philippines, continuously to conquer and oppress people of color in other parts of the world. This is the story of America. Of course, this is an overly simplistic view. Some would say that this is anti American. I don't care what they have to say. This is how I view it. Now, as far as the ideals of the United States, what the United States is purported to believe, things such as all men are created equal, these were high ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence, but as many people will tell you, either explicitly or implicitly, the founders of the United States, the founding fathers, these rich aristocratic men, did not really believe that Native Americans or the imported slaves from Africa and the conquered Native Americans were part of their plan for this new form of government, this new democracy that they had in mind, that they were going to resurrect Athenian democracy, which had been long dead in the ancient world and long dead in the old world. In the new world, they did not include Native Americans or Africans in this scheme. That just was not in their cards. Eventually, of course, Native American nations and African American people would be incorporated into their country, African Americans specifically after the Civil War and after slavery. But old habits die hard, and we are still dealing with racial injustice in our nation today in 2020. You know what I mean? So um, it is understandable that a certain segment of the population would say that they don't acknowledge the Independence Day of European or white settlers in North America. And this segment of the population is, of course, indigenous people and African Americans, and even Asians. Asian Americans were not also included in the scheme of this grand scheme of things. In terms of Hispanic Americans or Latinos, people from countries south of the United States, they also were looked at as beneath Anglo settlers because despite sharing some European DNA, many also shared African DNA, indigenous DNA in much higher degrees than white North Americans, especially in countries like Mexico, where the um, indigenous bloodlines were predominant, and in countries in the Caribbean, where African bloodlines were very predominant. In countries like places like southern Brazil or Chile or Argentina or Paraguay, Uruguay, not really so much. Um, the native populations there were completely decimated, and Africans indentured labor and slavery. Slaves were never really imported to a large extent. So just like in North America, those people were mostly those countries were mostly occupied by, you know, various European settlers from various European backgrounds, mostly Spanish, mostly Italian, and Southern Europeans in those, in those places. But most commonly, most people of Latin American origin here in the United States come from countries in the Caribbean or Mexico or Central America, where indigenous DNA and African DNA is much more higher than um, European DNA. So they're considered by American standards to be non-white. So they're put on a lower ebb of the racial totem pole here in the States. So they as well would not celebrate this, especially Chicanos or Mexican Americans who themselves were victims of this idea of manifest destiny that Americans later developed. The idea that America was destined to be a country from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That Americans, specifically Anglo Americans, white Americans, were destined to conquer the entire continent and did. And Chicanos and Mexican Americans were subject to discrimination, racism, lynchings, similar to Native Americans and African Americans in other parts of the United States. So it's again understandable why they would also be upset and they would not want to celebrate this holiday. In terms of the word Indian, of course, this misnomer, this misnaming of a people developed when Christopher Columbus believed that he had landed in um, the Indies, what today is the countries of South Asia. So he mislabeled the people as Indian. They are not Indian. They are indigenous Americans. And right now, as we speak, Donald Trump was made a speech in Mount Rushmore, which is one of their secret sites of one of the main adversaries of American expansionism, the Lakota Sioux tribe. And America, the United States, as a sign of their imperialism, built a monument that honors four American presidents: George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and Thomas Jefferson, that were very anti-indigenous people and very racist. So this is very disrespectful and very exclusionary. But this is typical when a people conquers another people. They tend to build monuments that are very disrespectful and highly controversial. But because people of color now in 2020 or in the 21st century, more so than in the 19th or 18th century, are gaining more of a voice because of what happened to George Floyd. Many other groups are voicing also their disapproval with systemic racism. People are demanding that these statues and these monuments to these famous dead Caucasian men are taken down. And again, understandably so. Now, whether or not people should use the Black Lives Matter movements and the movement against police brutality of African Americans for their own political agenda for something else different is debatable, especially when people of color, non-black POCs, tend to engage in a lot of the same anti-blackness that um, whites engage in. So, and don't say it isn't true. I made another video before on the um, immigration controversy between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where I explained that one side of the island is very racially mixed and very racially ambiguous, while the other side of the island is very unambiguously African and very pro-black in its politics, and the eastern side of the island, known as the Dominican Republic, is very discriminatory towards the um, the black side of the island, and that's a very well-known fact. So people of color, non-black POCs, can engage in behaviors of anti-blackness just as much as whites, but then they want to use the Black Lives Matter movement to push their own political agendas that have nothing to do with the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, I mean, like you don't really respect the path that African American civil rights activists pushed forward in the 1960s to advocate for racial equality, but you want to piggyback off of the struggle of African Americans in this country. It just isn't fair, in my view, in my estimation. Because like when we saw the protests against police brutality in cities like Chicago, many of the main ones that were going out and going really hard and killing these protesters were so-called Latinos or Hispanic Americans, and that was really sad to me as a Hispanic American because we should all be united in our struggle to dismantle the systems of white supremacy, but we unfortunately are not. Now, it goes way deeper than just celebrating a holiday or whatever. It's systems put in place since the beginning of the country to oppress people of color, and not only to oppress people of color, but to divide people of color based on these categories that they themselves invent. They the whites invented to put people into boxes. Anyway, guys, that's enough for today. Hope you enjoyed this rather lengthy video. Peace.